You think you know the British royal family. You think you understand their rules, their traditions, their unspoken codes. But what if everything you believed about loyalty, honor, and privilege was about to be shattered in one devastating moment? What if a single decision, a single stroke of a pen, could erase a prince from the family he was born into, leaving him stripped of titles, power, and the very identity he thought was untouchable? Today, we are about to unravel a story so explosive, so raw, that it has shaken the monarchy to its core. A story that begins with a prince who believed he was untouchable and a king who finally had enough. Yes, I'm talking about Prince Harry, and yes, this is the moment King Charles struck the hammer blow that would change everything. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine being told, overnight, that the titles you carried, the privileges you took for granted, the very name that opened doors across the world, were no longer yours. Imagine the humiliation, the heartbreak, and the rage. This wasn't a misstep, an accident, or a misunderstanding. This was a calculated move. King Charles, after years of patience, after years of watching his youngest son walk a path that challenged the very foundation of the monarchy, decided to draw a line in the sand. And he drew it so sharply, so decisively, that there is no coming back. You've seen the headlines, the snippets on social media, the fleeting news clips. You've read about Harry stepping back from royal duties, about the palace tensions, the interviews, the memoirs, the leaked letters. But none of that truly captures the magnitude of what happened behind closed doors. None of it explains the storm that erupted when Charles delivered the verdict. And none of it tells you what's coming next, because the fallout of this decision is only just beginning. Let's start from the beginning. Prince Harry wasn't always the subject of whispers, scandals, and intrigue. For years, he was the Golden Prince, the one the public adored for his charm, his courage, his military service. He was the son who carried his mother's spirit, the one who honored Princess Diana's legacy in every public appearance. But beneath the smiles, the charity work, and the photogenic moments, tensions had been simmering for years. Tensions that would eventually erupt into a full-blown royal crisis, one that no advisor, no mediator, and no public relations team could contain. You might ask, what could possibly drive a king to take such a drastic step against his own son? After all, this isn't just about a disagreement at the dinner table or a difference in opinion on royal matters. This is about legacy, reputation, and control. It's about a monarchy that has survived centuries, wars, scandals, and revolutions, suddenly confronting a reality where one of its own is threatening to rewrite the rules entirely. And when you start to peel back the layers, the picture becomes more shocking, more complicated, and far more personal than anyone outside those gilded walls could have imagined. Let's take a moment to picture the scene. Buckingham Palace, a room filled with advisors, lawyers, and aides. Tension thick enough to choke anyone who steps inside. Charles, normally composed, his voice low but unwavering, delivering words that will reverberate across continents. And Harry, standing there, a mixture of defiance, disbelief, and betrayal written across his face. This is not a confrontation you can script for a movie. It is real life, raw and unforgiving. But what led to this moment? What series of events, choices, and secrets built up to the day the hammer finally fell? It's not just Harry's decisions that brought him here. It's a combination of family disputes, public scrutiny, leaked information, and decisions that, in retrospect, seem almost fated. From the public revelations about his and Meghan's private dealings to the controversial interviews that shook royal protocol to the rumored financial disputes and the alleged attempts to bypass the traditional hierarchy, each act built tension like a slowly tightening noose. And when that noose was finally pulled, the impact was catastrophic. You have to wonder, how did it feel for Harry, the once beloved prince, to watch his identity be systematically stripped away? Not just the titles, but the privileges, the honors, the very recognition of his role in a family that had defined him since birth. And what about the rest of the royal family? Queen Camilla, Prince William, Princess Anne, each reacting in ways that reveal alliances, rivalries, and hidden agendas. And the public? The world watched, tweeted, and speculated, but no one could see the full story, the private heartbreak, the whispered threats, the late-night meetings that determined the future of one of the most famous men alive. And yet, despite the public spectacle, there are pieces of this story that remain buried. Letters that were never released, conversations that never reached journalists, and decisions that were kept under the strictest secrecy. And it's these hidden details that truly explain the magnitude of Charles's action. The hammer blow that didn't just remove a title, but attempted to reshape the very future of the monarchy itself. Because once Harry's titles were stripped, the rules of the game changed. The monarchy had sent a message, not just to Harry, but to the world. No one, no matter how beloved, could challenge the hierarchy without facing consequences. Now, you might be thinking, wasn't there any chance of reconciliation? That some behind-the-scenes negotiation could have prevented this fallout? Perhaps. But from what insiders have revealed, every attempt at diplomacy, every private plea, and every compromise was either ignored, rejected, or deemed insufficient. King Charles, by all accounts, had reached a point where patience was exhausted, discretion was no longer an option, and the only path forward was decisive action. And it was not only a decision of authority, but a statement of intent about how power, legacy, and loyalty function at the very top of one of the world's oldest institutions. So what comes next for Harry? Where does a man go when he is stripped of his royal identity, faced with the cold reality of isolation, and confronted with a public narrative he can't control? And what does this mean for Meghan, Archie, and Lilibet? How does the family rebuild, or does it even have the chance to heal? The answers are not simple, and the consequences are still unfolding, which is why every second of this story matters. And just when you think you have an idea of the fallout, that's when the real shock hits. Because this isn't just a story of titles and privilege. It's about secrets, betrayals, and revelations that no one saw coming. From leaked communications that expose hidden agendas to financial decisions that have stunned even the closest advisors, to personal confrontations that reveal the raw human emotions behind the public faces. The story of Harry being struck down by Charles is a story layered with intrigue, heartbreak, and drama. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Not all royal battles happen in public. Some of the most devastating confrontations take place behind closed doors, away from the flashing cameras and tabloid headlines. And yet, the signs were always there, subtle and almost imperceptible to the casual observer. Prince Harry's life in the months leading up to King Charles's hammer blow was a series of carefully orchestrated appearances, discreet interviews, and behind-the-scenes maneuvering. On the surface, he was the same charismatic, charming prince the world had grown to love. But beneath the tailored suits and polished smiles, a storm was brewing. A storm no one could ignore once it finally broke. Picture it. A crisp London morning, the palace corridors echoing with the faint sound of footsteps and hushed voices. Advisors scurry to their meetings, aides shuffle documents, and Harry moves from one engagement to another, unaware that every interaction, every misstep, is being scrutinized and weighed. For years, he had navigated royal life with precision, balancing public duty with personal ambition, all under the relentless gaze of a global audience. Yet, for all his skill, he could not have anticipated the magnitude of what was about to come. You might ask, how could someone as experienced as Harry be caught off guard? After all, he had faced media scrutiny, family tension, and the glare of public opinion for years. The truth is, no one could have predicted the full force of King Charles's decision. Because this was not merely a reprimand. This was a calculated, decisive action that would ripple through the monarchy, the media, and the lives of those closest to him. And what makes it even more shocking is that, in the weeks leading up to the blow, Harry seemed almost oblivious to the severity of the threat. Consider his public engagements during this period. He was seen attending charity galas, mental health initiatives, and veteran events, all while projecting the image of a prince committed to service and compassion. He laughed with supporters, posed for photographs, and delivered speeches filled with empathy and gravitas. Yet behind the smiles, insiders reported growing friction with palace officials. Some whispered that Harry's growing independence, his attempts to forge a path outside traditional royal duties, was creating anxiety within the family. And while the public saw dedication, the palace saw defiance. And it wasn't just the public appearances that signaled trouble. Even within the palace walls, subtle tensions were mounting. Meetings that had once been routine became charged with undercurrents of irritation. Advisors noticed his increasingly pointed questions, his refusal to follow certain protocols, and his persistent efforts to carve out an identity separate from the monarchy. Small disagreements, dismissed by casual observers as trivial, were actually pieces of a much larger puzzle. Every email, memo, and offhand comment contributed to a growing perception that Harry was a liability, a potential disruption to the carefully maintained image of the royal family. At the same time, Harry was struggling with his own personal conflicts. He was caught between loyalty to his family and loyalty to his wife, Meghan Markle, whose presence in the royal sphere had already created waves of controversy. Public opinion was divided. Social media debates raged, tabloids speculated endlessly, and every interview became a potential flashpoint. Harry faced criticism, praise, and speculation in equal measure, but inside, the emotional toll was mounting. Each smile was a mask, each public handshake, a careful choreography designed to maintain appearances while the internal storm continued to build. And this was the calm before the storm. A calm that, in hindsight, was deceptively quiet. Because while Harry navigated these engagements, King Charles and his advisors were quietly preparing their response. They observed, they documented, and they strategized, laying the groundwork for a decision that would alter the course of Harry's life forever. The tension was invisible to the world, but palpable to those inside the palace. Each day, each meeting, each passing moment was a step closer to an inevitable confrontation. So what was the tipping point? Was it a single moment, a single conversation, or a long series of perceived slights and strategic missteps? Insiders suggest it was all of the above. Harry's growing independence, his public statements, and his private actions, all combined to create a perception of defiance that Charles could no longer ignore. And when you consider the history of the royal family, it becomes clear why such a decisive response was necessary in their eyes. The monarchy is built on hierarchy, tradition, and control. Any perceived disruption to that structure is met with swift, sometimes ruthless action. And for Harry, that action was about to arrive in full force. But even as the storm approached, Harry remained unaware of the full scale of what awaited him. He continued with his duties, smiling for cameras, delivering speeches, and attending charity events. He met with aides and advisors, each conversation seemingly routine. Yet beneath the surface, every decision he made was being evaluated, every action weighed against a backdrop of family loyalty, protocol, and precedent. It was a delicate balance, one that he was unknowingly on the brink of tipping. And while Harry might have thought he was navigating the palace maze with skill, there were signals he couldn't ignore, signals that in hindsight were ominous warnings. A tightened security protocol, a sudden shift in seating arrangements at family events, whispered conversations in corridors where his presence was merely tolerated. These were the subtle markers of tension, the early indicators that the calm he experienced was temporary, fragile, and deceptive. What makes this moment so compelling and so shocking is the duality of Harry's experience. On the outside, he maintained the image of control, confidence, and charisma. On the inside, he was unknowingly standing on the precipice of a life-altering decision, one that would strip him of everything he had ever known. It's a stark reminder that appearances can be deceiving, and even those who seem invincible are vulnerable when the stakes are high enough. So, as the world watched Harry move through his last months of relative normalcy, the palace was quietly laying the groundwork for a decision that would shock not just Harry, but the public, the media, and even members of the royal family itself. This was a calm before a storm, a calm that would be shattered by a hammer blow so decisive that it left no room for negotiation, no chance for reconciliation, and no hope of returning to the status quo. And as the days ticked closer to the fateful moment, one question loomed over every palace corridor, every meeting, every whispered conversation. What would happen when Charles finally made his move? How would Harry respond when confronted with a decision that could erase his identity, redefine his life, and rewrite his place in history? The tension was unbearable. The stakes were unimaginable. And the world, blissfully unaware, was about to witness a confrontation that would leave everyone stunned. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. When families fight, the world rarely sees the battles that matter most. And in the case of Prince Harry and King Charles, the confrontation that would define their relationship and shake the monarchy did not happen on camera, on social media, or in public statements. It happened behind closed doors, in a room where the stakes were personal, political, and irreversibly high. Imagine being face to face with your father, a man who embodies centuries of tradition, a man whose authority stretches back generations, and feeling the full weight of that power bear down on you. That's exactly what Harry experienced. The meeting itself was described by insiders as tense, electric, and emotionally raw. The air in the room was thick with unspoken resentment and long-held grievances. Advisors were present, yes, but they were mere witnesses to a confrontation that was, at its core, deeply personal. Charles, normally measured and patient, did not mince words. Every sentence, every pause, was deliberate. He was there to send a message, not just to Harry, but to the world, to the royal household, and to the legacy of the monarchy itself. The confrontation began like any discussion, with words that seemed calm on the surface but carried undertones of accusation. Charles laid out his expectations: loyalty, adherence to protocol, respect for tradition. Harry, confident yet wary, countered with his own perspective, emphasizing his desire to carve out a path that honored his mother's legacy while allowing for personal freedom. But what seemed like a negotiation quickly escalated. Past frustrations, previously buried under layers of diplomacy and public niceties, surfaced in sharp, cutting phrases. "You cannot keep challenging the monarchy without consequences," Charles allegedly said, his voice low but unwavering. "Every decision you make reflects on the entire family. Every action has repercussions beyond your understanding." His words were not just a warning. They were an ultimatum, a declaration that the era of leniency was over. Harry's response was a mixture of defiance and hurt. "I've tried to do what's right," he said, his tone tinged with frustration. "I've served, I've honored, and yet it feels like nothing is ever enough. I am more than a title. I am more than a symbol. I have a life, responsibilities, and choices that matter." The words were heartfelt, but to Charles, they were indicative of a deeper problem, a perception that Harry placed personal ambition and public image above duty, tradition, and family loyalty. The conversation escalated as emotions ran high. Charles reminded Harry of the family's history, the sacrifices made by generations before him, and the expectations placed upon those who bear royal titles. He referenced past interviews, leaked communications, and public statements that had caused friction within the palace and beyond. Each example was carefully chosen to underscore the perceived pattern of behavior, building the case that Harry had repeatedly acted in ways that undermined the monarchy's stability. But Harry did not back down. He argued for independence, for recognition of his own choices, and for the legitimacy of his and Meghan's efforts to establish a life separate from traditional royal duties. He reminded Charles of the charity work he had done, the military service he had undertaken, and the public support he had garnered worldwide. These points, while compelling, were framed against centuries of rigid expectation, a scale that favored tradition over individual reasoning. At one point, the conversation reportedly turned to emotion, with Harry visibly shaken. "I am still your son," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I still love this family. I want to do the right thing, but I need to be heard, not punished." The plea hung in the air, heavy and fragile. It was an appeal to emotion, an attempt to bridge the chasm that had been growing between father and son. Charles, however, was unmoved. He remained resolute, a king focused on legacy and authority. "Being a son is not enough," he allegedly replied. "Being a prince comes with responsibilities that are non-negotiable. Choices have consequences. The time for leniency is over." His words were final, echoing through the room like a verdict rather than a conversation. Every word reinforced the gravity of the moment, signaling to Harry that this was no ordinary disagreement. This was a decisive turning point. Advisors in the room reportedly exchanged glances, knowing the significance of what was unfolding. They had seen arguments before, disagreements between family members. But this confrontation was different. The tension was not just familial. It was structural, a clash between tradition and modernity, authority and independence, father and son. The ramifications of this confrontation would extend far beyond the walls of the palace, reaching the global stage and altering public perception of the monarchy in ways that were still unimaginable. Harry attempted to mediate, to find compromise, to appeal to shared history and familial love. He reminded Charles of the values instilled by Princess Diana, of the importance of empathy and understanding, and of the public perception that often favored progress over rigidity. Yet, each attempt was met with firm rebuttals. Charles, who had patiently tolerated deviations and public disputes in the past, was no longer willing to negotiate. The foundation of authority, once assumed, was now unshakable. And then came the moment that would become the turning point. Charles, with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation, delivered the message that would define the outcome of the confrontation. He made it clear that Harry's titles, his privileges, and his place in the royal family were no longer guaranteed. It was not an idle threat, not a cautionary statement. It was a decree. And in that moment, the reality of the monarchy's uncompromising nature became undeniable to Harry. The impact on Harry was immediate. Shock, disbelief, and anger swirled together in a mix of emotions that were visible to all present. His carefully maintained composure cracked, revealing the raw human response to an unprecedented challenge. Advisors reported that Harry's response was a mixture of defensive argumentation, questioning, and, eventually, silent contemplation. It was the silence, they said, that carried the weight of realization, the understanding that his life, as he had known it, was about to change forever. Yet even as the confrontation reached its peak, there was an unspoken understanding between father and son. This was not the end of the dialogue. It was the beginning of a sequence of events that would unfold with unprecedented consequences. Every action that followed would be influenced by the emotional and strategic dynamics of this meeting. And while Harry may have left the room believing there was still room for negotiation, the reality was that the die had been cast. The world outside the palace remained unaware of the intensity of this confrontation. Public appearances continued, speeches were delivered, and media coverage remained focused on surface-level events. But within the palace, advisors, family members, and even security personnel understood the seismic shift that had occurred. The confrontation was more than a personal dispute. It was a restructuring of power, a recalibration of authority, and a signal to all members of the royal family that tradition, loyalty, and obedience were non-negotiable. And then, as Harry left the room, carrying with him the weight of the conversation, there was a sense of foreboding. The calm that had defined his previous months was gone. The storm was imminent. Decisions that had once seemed distant and theoretical were now painfully real. The ripple effects of this private confrontation would soon become public knowledge, and the consequences would be felt across the monarchy, the media, and the world at large. What Harry did not yet realize was that this confrontation was only the beginning. Behind the palace doors, plans had already been set in motion, communications had been drafted, and the machinery of monarchy was gearing up for a decisive strike. The private confrontation was the spark, but the fire that would consume Harry's royal standing was about to ignite. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The moment the hammer fell, the world would never see Prince Harry the same way again. Overnight, the titles he had carried since birth, the privileges, the honors, the very identity that had defined him, were revoked. Gone. Just like that. It was not a slow unraveling or a drawn-out process. It was a decisive, public, and irreversible action, delivered with a precision that left no room for misinterpretation. The prince who had once been the golden boy of the monarchy now faced a reality few could imagine, stripped of status, authority, and recognition. Imagine receiving news like that. One day, you are His Royal Highness, attended by aides, celebrated in ceremonies, and recognized by millions across the globe. The next day, all of it is gone. The letters before your name are erased. Invitations to state events vanish. Security arrangements change. The very structure of your life, carefully built around tradition, duty, and inherited prestige, crumbles. For Harry, it was a blow both practical and deeply personal. This was not a mistake. The decision was formal, backed by legal documents, official letters, and the approval of the highest advisors in the monarchy. Charles, having weighed the consequences, acted with absolute authority. According to insiders, the announcement was meticulously crafted to leave no ambiguity. Harry's titles, privileges, and standing within the royal family were officially removed. The communication went out through both internal channels and public statements, ensuring that the world would witness the gravity of the action. The public reaction was immediate and explosive. Headlines splashed across newspapers. Prince Harry stripped of titles, royal shock. Charles pulls the ultimate blow, the fall of the Golden Prince. Social media erupted with speculation, memes, and commentary. Fans expressed outrage, sympathy, confusion. Critics celebrated the move as a necessary act of authority. It was, in every sense, a moment that dominated global conversation. Yet the story was more complex than headlines suggested. The official announcement was only the tip of the iceberg. Behind the scenes, aides and advisors were scrambling to manage logistics. Changes in resident security, updates to ceremonial schedules, adjustments in royal finances, and preparations for public communications. Every palace department felt the ripple. Every move had to be coordinated, every message controlled, and every potential leak managed. The action was public, but the planning behind it was extraordinarily private. For Harry, the blow was both symbolic and practical. Titles carry weight, not just ceremonial, but legal and financial. They open doors, ensure access, and confer influence. Losing them means losing not only recognition but also resources, authority, and protection. It is the difference between being a member of the most famous family in the world and being a private citizen, albeit one with an extraordinary name. The psychological impact, insiders say, was devastating. A man accustomed to status, respect, and ceremonial influence suddenly found himself stripped to the bare minimum. The revocation of titles also had a domino effect on Harry's public engagements. Invitations to state dinners, charitable functions, and official ceremonies were rescinded. Any role that required a royal designation was immediately altered. Even small courtesies previously taken for granted, the use of royal vehicles, formal aids, and security details, were subject to reevaluation. To the public, this may have seemed minor, but for someone living under constant scrutiny, every change was a reminder of what had been lost. Meanwhile, the palace's communication team worked overtime to manage the narrative. Carefully worded statements emphasized the importance of duty, loyalty, and adherence to tradition. Publicly, Charles's move was framed as a necessary step to maintain the stability of the monarchy and uphold centuries of protocol. Critics saw it differently, suggesting that the action was harsh, emotionally charged, and perhaps even vindictive. But the messaging was clear. Harry's behavior had reached a point where decisive intervention was unavoidable. The reaction from the royal family was mixed. Some members expressed quiet support, acknowledging the need to maintain authority and uphold tradition. Others, however, reportedly struggled with the personal and emotional implications. For close family members who had watched Harry grow up, the decision was heartbreaking. There were whispers of regret, concern for public perception, and anxiety over potential fallout. Yet even amidst these internal debates, the decree remained firm. No one could reverse the decision, and no amount of negotiation could restore the titles once removed. Harry himself faced a private reckoning. The revocation of his titles forced him to confront a new reality. He was no longer a prince in the eyes of the law or the monarchy. This raised questions about his role in public life, his financial security, and the impact on his family. Even those closest to him admitted the emotional toll was immense. It wasn't just the loss of letters or privileges, it was the erasure of a life built around identity, tradition, and expectation. It was, in essence, a personal and professional exile without leaving the country. In the days that followed, the palace carefully orchestrated the public narrative. Official photographs, press releases, and statements reinforced the finality of the action. Media outlets worldwide dissected every word, speculated on the implications, and projected potential future conflicts. Yet beneath the polished statements, the internal dynamics of the family continued to shift. Harry's relationship with Charles, already strained, reached new depths of tension. Trust, once assumed, was fractured, and the ripple effects on other family members, Meghan, William, and Camilla, would be felt for months, if not years. There was also an international dimension to consider. Charles's move sent a message not only to Harry but to monarchies, governments, and royal watchers around the world. The British monarchy, often criticized for being slow to adapt, demonstrated decisiveness, authority, and an unwillingness to tolerate deviation from tradition. The consequences were far-reaching. Alliances, diplomatic relationships, and media portrayals all shifted in response to the unprecedented action. Meanwhile, Harry faced a barrage of private and public challenges. Advisors counseled him on legal recourse, financial planning, and public communication strategies. Supporters attempted to reassure him, while critics questioned the ethics of his behavior and the necessity of the punishment. Harry, navigating grief, anger, and disbelief, was confronted with a new reality in which every step had to be calculated, and every public appearance scrutinized for potential missteps. And then there were the personal consequences. The loss of titles meant not only a change in public perception, but also an internal crisis. Who was Harry without the trappings of royalty? How would he define himself in a world that had suddenly stripped him of the identity he had carried his entire life? These were questions with no easy answers, and the emotional impact, insiders suggest, was profound. Yet, even as Harry processed this upheaval, the public remained captivated, consuming every headline, tweet, and news segment. The story became a global spectacle, a cautionary tale about power, family, and the high cost of defiance. Analysts debated, social media erupted, and every subsequent action taken by Harry or Charles was scrutinized in real time. The world had witnessed a hammer blow, and no one could look away. But just when it seemed that the story had reached its climax, insiders hint that Charles's move was not the final act. The revocation of titles was a decisive strike, yes, but it was also a signal. More revelations, more confrontations, and more consequences were still to come. Harry's journey, already transformed, was far from over. And what came next would push the boundaries of royal conflict even further, and no one saw it coming. When King Charles struck the hammer blow that stripped Harry of his titles, he didn't just impact a prince. He sent shockwaves through the entire royal family. And at the center of this maelstrom was Meghan Markle. The Duchess of Sussex, already a lightning rod for controversy, suddenly found herself facing scrutiny on a scale that few could have predicted. She was no longer just Harry's wife, a partner in his journey. She had become a central figure in a story that questioned loyalty, privilege, and the very fabric of the monarchy. Imagine being Meghan in that moment. Overnight, the world viewed her through a new lens, not just as a duchess, not just as Harry's partner, but as someone deeply entangled in a family feud that was now public, messy, and personal. Every interview she had ever given, every public appearance, every statement was suddenly reevaluated. The court of public opinion, ever fickle, was quick to pass judgment. Some defended her as a devoted partner, an advocate for causes, and a victim of royal rigidity. Others portrayed her as a disruptor, a source of tension, or even a catalyst for the fallout that had befallen Harry. Inside the palace, tensions were palpable. Sources report that Queen Camilla and several senior aides were particularly focused on Meghan, closely observing her interactions with Harry and other family members. There was a sense that her influence, both real and perceived, was a factor in Charles's decision. Every conversation she had, every public engagement, and even her private communications were being scrutinized for evidence of intervention, rebellion, or strategic maneuvering. It was a high-stakes environment where missteps could have enormous consequences. At the same time, Meghan faced her own emotional battle. She had entered the royal family with high hopes, embracing tradition while seeking to maintain her individuality. But as the storm around Harry intensified, she found herself caught between loyalty to her husband and navigating a family steeped in protocol and history. The emotional toll was immense. Insiders described her as being in a state of constant vigilance, aware that her every move could be interpreted as a challenge or a threat. Stress levels reportedly skyrocketed, and the pressure to protect her family while maintaining public composure was overwhelming. One of the most intense points of contention involved the role Meghan had played in Harry's public actions and private decisions. Some in the palace suggested that her influence had encouraged Harry to push boundaries, make controversial statements, or engage in initiatives that challenged tradition. Others argued that Harry was fully responsible for his choices and that Meghan was being unfairly scapegoated. The reality, as often is the case in royal dynamics, was likely somewhere in between, a complex interplay of partnership, ambition, and perception. Publicly, Meghan attempted to maintain grace and composure, attending events and engaging with charities as usual. Yet the media narrative was relentless. Every appearance, every word, every gesture was analyzed for signs of tension, complicity, or defiance. Social media exploded with speculation. Was Meghan behind Harry's rebellion? Was she manipulating events? Was she being unfairly blamed? The online commentary became a digital battlefield, with supporters and critics clashing in a constant, unrelenting stream of debate. At home, the stress manifested in private challenges as well. Security adjustments, legal consultations, and management of their children, Archie and Lilibet, became fraught with tension. Reports suggest that Meghan was acutely aware that the revocation of Harry's titles would affect the children indirectly, altering how they were perceived in public and impacting their future interactions with royal events and institutions. The emotional stakes were personal, not just strategic. And yet, amidst all this chaos, Meghan reportedly had her own strategy. Insiders indicate that she worked tirelessly behind the scenes to safeguard her family's interests. Whether negotiating with aides, managing media narratives, or planning next steps for financial and personal security, Meghan's efforts were relentless. Some viewed this as shrewd and necessary. Others framed it as evidence of ambition or defiance. But one thing was clear: Meghan was not a passive participant in the unfolding drama. She was actively navigating a storm in which she had no choice but to assert herself. The tension between Meghan and other royal figures became increasingly apparent in private moments. Sources describe meetings where discussions of Harry's status, the titles, and future royal engagements devolved into heated debates. Meghan's presence, according to some insiders, was perceived as both a protective shield for Harry and a challenge to the established order. Every interaction carried the weight of centuries of tradition clashing with the modern realities of personal choice and media scrutiny. Yet, for all the external pressures, there were intimate, deeply personal moments that revealed Meghan's vulnerability. Friends reported that she felt isolated, misunderstood, and under constant judgment. The loss of Harry's titles wasn't just a professional or public setback. It was a personal threat, a destabilizing force that challenged her sense of security, identity, and belonging. Every decision became amplified, every word scrutinized, and every move potentially explosive. At the same time, Meghan's response was strategic. She carefully curated her public appearances, selected her interviews, and communicated messages that balanced empathy, strength, and resolve. She had to navigate the dual realities of a family in crisis and a global audience watching her every step. The complexity of this role cannot be overstated. She was protecting her family, managing her reputation, and simultaneously confronting a centuries-old institution determined to maintain control. And yet, even as Meghan worked to assert control, the personal toll was undeniable. Emotional exhaustion, stress, and the pressure of constant scrutiny were reportedly taking a toll on her mental health. Insiders describe her as navigating a maze of emotional, social, and logistical challenges that few outside the palace could understand. Every day was a balancing act between protecting her family, maintaining her public image, and surviving in an environment that had suddenly become hostile. Despite these pressures, Meghan remained resolute in her support of Harry. Sources indicate that she reinforced his decisions, advised on media strategy, and worked to ensure that their family remained united in the face of the unprecedented blow from Charles. Her influence, whether perceived as positive or negative, was undeniably significant. She was the anchor in Harry's life amidst the storm of revoked titles, shifting allegiances, and public scrutiny. Yet, for all her efforts, Meghan could not fully control the narrative. The media, the public, and even some members of the royal family were actively shaping the story in ways that created tension, division, and conflict. Rumors of secret communications, private letters, and undisclosed meetings circulated, fueling speculation and intensifying the stakes. Every action Meghan took was magnified, dissected, and debated on a scale that few could endure without emotional and psychological strain. And as the world focused on Harry's loss, Meghan found herself in the crossfire, accused, analyzed, and misunderstood, while simultaneously trying to navigate the personal consequences of her husband's stripped titles. Every step was a negotiation, every conversation a test, and every appearance a potential flashpoint. The Duchess of Sussex, once seen as a symbol of modern royal influence, now faced a reality that was as harsh as it was unprecedented. But even as Meghan fought to protect her family and assert her influence, the palace had plans that would escalate the situation further. Decisions, communications, and actions were already underway that could challenge even her most carefully laid strategies. And what came next would put Meghan directly in the eye of a storm that no one, not even the most powerful advisors, could fully predict. And what came next would shock the world, and no one saw it coming. The British royal family has always been a study in duality. Public pageantry, ceremonial splendor, and meticulous protocol on one side, and private intrigue, whispered secrets, and unseen power plays on the other. While the world focused on Harry losing his titles and Meghan navigating the crossfire, something more subtle, and arguably more dangerous, was unfolding behind the gilded doors of the palace. Whispers, rumors, hidden alliances, betrayals that never reached the media. This was the true engine of power, the unseen forces shaping the very fate of the youngest Sussex. Imagine walking through the corridors of Buckingham Palace. The walls, lined with centuries of history, have witnessed intrigue that would rival any novel. Footsteps echo, doors close softly, and conversations, seemingly innocent on the surface, carry undercurrents of strategy, opinion, and influence. Advisors huddle in corners, aides pass whispered messages, and senior officials maneuver around personalities with the precision of chess masters. This is the environment in which the decisions about Harry's fate were not only discussed, they were engineered. Whispers began circulating months before the titles were stripped. Small incidents, an awkward meeting, a tense dinner, a cryptic memo, were magnified through palace channels. Insiders observed Harry's increasing independence, his and Meghan's public statements, and the subtle deviations from protocol. In a household defined by hierarchy and tradition, every deviation is noticed. Every action is catalogued. Every misstep is remembered. These whispers, quiet to the casual observer, carried tremendous weight in determining how Charles and the senior advisors would act. The palace, as insiders describe it, is a world unto itself, a place where loyalty is currency, discretion is survival, and influence is wielded silently. When the titles were finally revoked, it was the culmination of these months of quiet maneuvering. Every whisper, every subtle observation, every private meeting contributed to a narrative carefully constructed to justify the hammer blow. To the public, it seemed like a sudden act of authority. In reality, it was a meticulously crafted response to perceived threats, both personal and structural. And yet, not all whispers were negative. Some aides quietly expressed sympathy for Harry, recognizing the emotional and personal toll he had endured. Others warned Charles that a public fallout could harm the monarchy's image. But the persuasive force of tradition, hierarchy, and the weight of centuries ultimately dominated the internal debate. Advisors understood that maintaining authority and precedent outweighed individual sentiment. The whispers of caution were drowned out by the louder, unyielding call for decisive action. The palace is also a place of alliances, some visible, some invisible. Certain factions reportedly supported Charles's decision, seeing Harry as a destabilizing influence and Meghan as a force of modern disruption that challenged the old order. Others quietly attempted to mediate, to provide perspective, or even to warn Harry of the impending consequences. These internal dynamics, subtle and opaque, created a web of influence that shaped every decision, every statement, and every strategic move. One of the most fascinating aspects of these whispers was how they highlighted the contrast between perception and reality. To the world, Harry's decisions seemed bold, independent, and even rebellious. Within the palace, however, each move was evaluated not only for its public impact, but for its implications on internal stability, family hierarchy, and historical precedent. A simple act, A media interview, a charitable initiative, or a seemingly innocuous comment could be interpreted as defiance, disloyalty, or even a threat to the monarchy's credibility. And it wasn't just the senior advisors shaping the narrative. Extended family members, courtiers, and even certain long-serving staff contributed to the chorus of whispers. Each person had their own perspective, biases, and agendas. Some were protective of the monarchy, some sympathetic to Harry, and others had their own ambitions. In this environment, truth is elusive, perception is reality, and the whispers often wield more power than official proclamations. The effect on Harry and Meghan was profound. They were aware, to some extent, of the murmurs surrounding them, but they could never fully understand the scale or intensity. Every interaction, every meeting, every glance in the palace could carry hidden meaning. Insiders suggest that Harry, for all his confidence, began to feel the weight of unseen forces, an invisible pressure that dictated not only how he could act, but how he must appear. Meghan, acutely aware of the palace machinery, reportedly spent countless hours strategizing, predicting, and responding to scenarios before they unfolded. These whispers were more than gossip. They were the prelude to action. They set the stage for the revocation of titles, the public fallout, and the personal confrontations that followed. Every hint, every suggestion, every quietly expressed opinion contributed to a narrative that justified decisive intervention. The hammer did not fall spontaneously. It was built on months of observation, analysis, and subtle persuasion. And yet, for all their strategic precision, whispers are unpredictable. Rumors can spread, misinterpretations can escalate, and a single misstep can have unintended consequences. Some insiders reportedly feared that the plan might backfire, that public sentiment could turn against the palace, or that Harry and Meghan could leverage media attention to reshape the narrative. These concerns created a delicate tension, one where every move had to be calculated, every statement carefully crafted, and every reaction anticipated. But even amidst the uncertainty, one thing was clear. The palace was united in one objective: to maintain control, enforce tradition, and protect the monarchy's legacy. And if that required stripping a prince of his titles, alienating the public, or challenging personal relationships, so be it. Authority, history, and hierarchy demanded no less. The whispers also revealed a deeper truth about power within the monarchy. Influence is not always exercised openly. It is exercised through subtle suggestion, strategic framing, and quiet pressure. Those who understand the rules of the palace know how to wield it effectively, and those who underestimate it, no matter how famous, beloved, or charismatic, can find themselves facing consequences they never anticipated. For Harry, these whispers were invisible yet omnipresent. They shaped decisions, colored interactions, and, ultimately, contributed to the inevitability of the hammer blow. And for Meghan, understanding the web of influence was both a challenge and a necessity, as she sought to protect her family while navigating the unpredictable currents of palace power. Yet even as the whispers intensified, the outside world remained largely unaware. The public saw headlines, interviews, and curated appearances, but the real battle, the subtle, quiet, high-stakes game, played out beyond the view of cameras and media. It was a reminder that in the royal world, perception is only part of the story, and the real story often lies in the unseen, whispered corridors of power. And just when it seemed that Harry and Meghan had begun to grasp the scope of the palace machinations, something unexpected emerged. An ally, previously considered neutral, revealed information that threatened to tilt the balance, expose secrets, and escalate tensions further. The whispers that had guided decisions for months suddenly became a storm capable of uprooting everything in its path. But what came next would expose hidden agendas, shake loyalties, and push the royal family into a crisis no one saw coming. When the hammer fell on Harry, the repercussions weren't limited to titles or public perception. The revocation of his royal status unleashed a storm that extended into the financial realm, a world as secretive, complex, and high-stakes as the palace itself. Money, after all, is power, and the Sussexes' financial arrangements had long been under scrutiny, both by the family and the public. Now, stripped of his titles, Harry faced not only a loss of privilege but a sudden redefinition of his access to funds, assets, and inherited resources. Imagine the impact: lifelong access to royal estates, allowances, and private funds suddenly limited. Security arrangements, household budgets, and ceremonial expenses, all previously covered by the monarchy, now became questions of negotiation, management, or even withdrawal. Financial stability, once assumed, was suddenly contingent on a mix of legal maneuvering, public appearances, and personal income. For a prince accustomed to a certain standard of life and status, this was more than a logistical challenge. It was a stark confrontation with the consequences of his decisions. Insiders described the internal palace briefings that followed the decision. Advisors and legal teams immediately began analyzing which assets Harry could retain, what funds were accessible, and how public perception might impact charitable foundations associated with him and Meghan. Every dollar, every trust fund, every contractual obligation was scrutinized. The revocation of titles was not just symbolic. It was an instrument that reshaped the family's financial landscape and sent a message about accountability, authority, and control. The fallout quickly extended to public perception. Social media users speculated about the Sussexes' wealth, how they would maintain their lifestyle, and whether Harry could continue funding projects without the royal backing he once enjoyed. Analysts debated potential income streams, from book deals to media appearances, estimating how long he could sustain a life previously guaranteed by privilege. The discussion wasn't abstract. It was tangible and immediate, a reflection of how intertwined status, perception, and financial power can be. Even before the titles were formally revoked, palace aides had begun compiling reports on the couple's expenditures, investments, and charitable endeavors. Every engagement, travel arrangement, and public initiative was assessed in light of its potential risk to the family's image and finances. Critics suggested this scrutiny was excessive, but in a household where precedent, tradition, and hierarchy dictate every move, such diligence is standard protocol. Every action that could be perceived as misuse or mismanagement was recorded, cataloged, and prepared for potential use in internal or public discourse. The financial strain was not just theoretical. Sources suggest that Harry faced immediate logistical challenges: adjustments to household budgets, reconsideration of staff salaries, and a re-evaluation of property access. Privileges such as security, private wings and estates, and access to official royal transport were suddenly subject to new rules, recalibrating what he and Meghan could claim without controversy or breach of protocol. The sudden shift required immediate adaptation, a task made more difficult by the intense public scrutiny already facing them. Adding to the complexity was the ripple effect on charitable endeavors. Harry and Meghan had launched multiple initiatives, from mental health campaigns to veteran support foundations. While these projects remained active, questions emerged about funding, oversight, and the extent to which they were independent of royal support. Insiders reported urgent consultations with financial experts to ensure transparency and compliance with both internal regulations and public expectations. The financial stakes were not just personal. They had reputational consequences, potentially affecting the credibility and viability of initiatives that had taken years to establish. The financial fallout also exposed internal tensions within the royal household. Some advisors argued that the revocation of titles should have been accompanied by immediate restructuring of finances, while others insisted on a gradual transition to avoid public scandal. The debate, while largely hidden from public view, influenced every subsequent decision regarding Harry's access to funds, management of property, and even interactions with media contracts. Every choice carried consequences, and every misstep risked exacerbating the crisis. Meanwhile, Harry and Meghan faced an unprecedented balancing act. They needed to maintain a public image of stability, demonstrate fiscal responsibility, and continue philanthropic efforts, all while adjusting to a life suddenly less secure, less structured, and more precarious. Every press appearance, every interview, and every charitable initiative became an opportunity to reinforce legitimacy, counter narratives of privilege misuse, and reassure both the public and the monarchy that they were responsible and capable actors. The financial consequences extended beyond immediate cash flow and operational concerns. Advisors also had to consider long-term implications for inheritance, property rights, and the management of family trusts. Questions arose. Would Harry's children have access to the same funds as before? How would the revocation of titles affect succession-related resources? Could future income from media deals or personal enterprises be contested or restricted? The answers were complex, legally entangled, and politically sensitive, highlighting just how intertwined money, power, and identity are within the royal context. Complicating matters further, the revocation of titles intersected with public perception in ways that amplified the crisis. Social media and international press outlets debated whether the couple could sustain their lifestyle without royal backing. Every statement, every public appearance, and every project was analyzed for financial viability. The narrative wasn't just about privilege. It was about capability, sustainability, and resilience in the face of unprecedented change. For Harry, this added another layer of pressure to an already emotionally and politically fraught situation. Yet, despite the challenges, Harry and Meghan reportedly began taking proactive steps to stabilize their financial situation. Legal experts were consulted, financial advisors engaged, and contingency plans developed to manage the sudden loss of resources. The couple's goal was not only survival, but also to maintain influence and purpose in the public sphere. But the underlying reality remained. The loss of titles was a financial as well as symbolic blow, one that required rapid adaptation and strategic thinking. Insiders also noted that the financial fallout had broader implications for the monarchy itself. The decision to strip Harry of his titles signaled to other family members and the public that privilege carries responsibility. Missteps, perceived or real, have consequences. The message was both a warning and a precedent, reinforcing the importance of hierarchy, loyalty, and accountability. The reverberations were felt not just in Harry's immediate circle, but across the institutional structure of the royal household. And then there were the personal consequences. Harry, a man accustomed to a certain level of autonomy and influence, now had to navigate a world in which every financial move could be scrutinized, contested, or politicized. For Meghan, the challenge was equally intense, managing household stability, safeguarding the family's public image, and protecting the children, all while facing external criticism and internal pressures. The financial fallout was not an abstract problem. It was a lived reality, a daily test of resilience, strategy, and endurance. Even as Harry adjusted to the new financial landscape, rumors and speculation continued to swirl. Leaks suggested that palace officials were closely monitoring spending, communications hinted at internal debates over allowances, and legal consultations hinted at potential disputes over inheritance and trust funds. Every rumor, true or not, heightened the tension and reinforced the sense that Harry's position had fundamentally shifted. But the most consequential financial shock was yet to come. Decisions already in motion, communications quietly circulating among advisors, and strategic planning within the palace were set to reveal just how far-reaching the impact of the hammer blow truly was. Money, influence, and power were inextricably linked, and the next revelation would demonstrate the full weight of Charles's decision in ways that extended far beyond titles or ceremony. And what came next would force Harry and Meghan into a confrontation with financial realities, legal complexities, and public scrutiny that no one anticipated. And it would escalate the crisis to an entirely new level that in any family. Alliances and rivalries are inevitable. But within the British royal household, these dynamics are amplified 1,000-fold. Every gesture, every conversation, and every glance carries weight far beyond what meets the eye. When King Charles struck the hammer blow against Harry, the network of friends, advisors, and family members surrounding him became more important than ever. Allies could offer support, guidance, and influence, but enemies, silent or overt, could exploit the moment to consolidate power, advance agendas, or push Harry further into isolation. Harry, by all accounts, found himself navigating a treacherous landscape. On the surface, he had high-profile allies, people outside the palace who admired him for his service, his philanthropic work, and his willingness to challenge tradition. Celebrities, former colleagues, and charitable partners expressed support, amplified through social media, interviews, and public statements. They reassured him that the public would sympathize, that his actions were justified, and that he was still a prince in the eyes of the world. But inside the palace, the story was very different. Not all family members or close aides were supportive. Some quietly criticized his choices, citing breaches of protocol, media leaks, or deviations from tradition. Others remained neutral, unwilling to take sides, but aware that the repercussions of Harry's actions could ripple through their own lives. And then there were those who actively opposed him, working behind the scenes to ensure the consequences of his defiance were felt fully, and that Charles's authority remained unchallenged. The tension between allies and enemies created an atmosphere of constant uncertainty. Harry reportedly struggled to identify who he could trust, even among those who had previously offered guidance or support. In a household where loyalty is prized and discretion is paramount, every word, every gesture, and every meeting carried potential implications. A well-intentioned comment could be misinterpreted. A private conversation could be reported, and a single misplaced move could tip the balance between support and betrayal. Among Harry's closest allies were individuals who had worked with him for years: advisors, charitable partners, and military colleagues. These people offered strategic counsel, emotional support, and practical guidance. They helped him navigate legal complexities, plan public statements, and manage media interactions.